Okay, and we're recording. Ros, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for that very lovely introduction. And I'm delighted to be here, and especially pleased to see some familiar faces, which is lovely. So the title of my talk is Assessment of Sign Language Development in Deaf Children. It's a topic I got interested in before I did my PhD quite a few years ago. And at that time, there was really very little about this in terms of what was happening in schools, but also the research area. And I'm glad to say that has now changed. So let's kick off. I can get the slides to move. And these are the topics I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to say a little bit about deaf children's language development, but primarily because I want to think about what the aims of language assessment need to be. I'm going to talk about some of the challenges in sign language assessment, the skills that testers need in terms of knowing how to conduct assessments, but especially in understanding what test scores mean. Because conducting assessment is one thing, actually trying to make something meaningful out of that, in particular, supporting deaf children as a result of that in the right way is another skill, which is very important. So let's kick off, starting with thinking about deaf children's language development. Well, as you all know, things have changed very dramatically in recent years. And nowadays, children are getting diagnosed as being deaf at a much earlier age than previously, usually at birth. They have opportunities to have early cochlear implants. They have high quality digital amplification aids. And as a result of that, more children are also getting the opportunity for earlier intervention and better access, certainly to spoken language. The question is that also the same for sign language? We'll touch on that. The other areas that this has impacted on particularly is deaf children's spoken language. And we know now that early use of cochlear implants before the age of about 1 is very beneficial for language development. So some research has suggested that deaf children may be keeping up with their hearing peers in terms of their language performance and their reading. But the most important thing I want to put out here is that, yes, there have been improvements, but outcomes are highly variable. So we are still looking at large groups of children who are not doing the same as their hearing peers in terms of their spoken language. And there's been a recent emphasis among some researchers on talking about language deprivation. So this is where children haven't had access to, or haven't been able to access a language sufficiently to achieve the normal milestones in development. And there's been recommendations that children need to have early exposure to sign language because that's a language they can access. And especially children who are perhaps going on to have an implant, if they have an implant towards the end of the first year, well, what language input have they had before that implant is in place? Because these early months of the first years of life are so important for language development. So let's think a bit about how children learn their sign language. The most typical patterns of sign language acquisition happen in children who've got deaf parents. This is a very small proportion of the deaf community. So in these situations, families will often use sign language whether or not a child is deaf. So with hearing children, with deaf children, with deaf families, sign language may well be the first language that they use. And children will see the language around them, not just spoken to them. There's often going to be a community around the family. So as a result of this very rich language input, children in deaf families develop their sign language following the same sorts of milestones that we see in hearing children acquiring a spoken language. So the first words appear very early, around about the end of the first year, early sentences, and so on. And so this is very positive. It just shows that with the right input, of course, it is possible to develop very fluent sign language skills. But there are some children amongst children who've got deaf families and indeed hearing. Sorry.
I can't hear it. Can you?
Yeah. some children, even within deaf families, will have language impairments. So language impairments are something that, as a speech and language therapist, we know about in hearing children. About 7% of hearing children will have a language impairment, not because they can't hear a language, and not because they don't get exposed to language, but because they have an inherent difficulty processing and using language. And our recent research has shown that a similar proportion of signing children also seem to have these sorts of language impairments. So even within children who've got deaf families where the environment is optimal for language learning, we still need to be alert to the fact that there are potential risks in terms of language acquisition. So these children need to be assessed. So of the larger proportion of children who have hearing parents, well, what happens there? Parents typically don't know sign language until they have a deaf child, and so they have to learn it. It very much depends on the sorts of support they have to help them to learn sign language, and of course their own motivation. But what we see very typically is that signing levels in hearing parents are low, certainly not the same as in native signing deaf parents. And often sign language exposure to children is correspondingly late. So it may well be that children in hearing families are only exposed to sign language when they've failed to develop a spoken language, or certainly until their parents have acquired sufficient skills. So not surprisingly, children in hearing families are at risk for delayed language acquisition in a sign language. The other thing we need to think about is the high prevalence of additional difficulties in deaf children. Now, depending on which research you look at, the figures do vary, but up to 40% of deaf children may have additional difficulties which may impact and affect their ability to learn a language. So because of all these reasons, deaf children are at risk for language development, which means we need to be monitoring their language development, not just in spoken language, but also in sign language. So before I sort of talk primarily about deaf children who are using sign language, I want to just also make a point here, which is that deaf children don't naturally fall into groups according to whether they use spoken or sign language, because many deaf children, in fact, most deaf children, will use both languages or may indeed use cross-modal blending. So they'll be using some signs while they speak. So looking at just spoken language or just sign language development, we need to take account of the fact that children don't fall neatly into those sorts of categories. And indeed, children's communication preferences change as time passes. So, for example, a child who was a strong signer may get an implant and then transition to use more spoken language. Or a child who's used spoken language at school may encounter the deaf community later on in their teens or in adulthood, and then develop a preference for sign language. So children's preferences change. Children use varying combinations of signs and spoken language. We need to be alert to this when we carry out assessments. But what's really important to bear in mind is that the type of language input children get, the timing of input they get, and the quality of input they get is so important. And of course, what is typical for many deaf children is that their input is so variable. So they're exposed to children with different sorts of communication skills in terms of sign language, and this is reflected to some extent in their ability to learn the language. So their ability to access language is very key, and that is dependent on the exposure they get. And all of these factors have to feed into language assessment in terms of thinking about how we're going to assess a child, but also what our assessment findings are telling us. So let's think about the aims of language assessment. So a key aim really is to see whether children are developing language at the time they should be expected to. So is their level of language, their proficiency in language appropriate for their age? We want to look at all the languages that children use and see how development compares. This is particularly important when we talk about things like, you know, education placement. If a child has got a particularly strong language, then it might make sense, for example, that their education is delivered in that language. So we want to look very holistically at children's communication. If children do have difficulties with language, we want to see what are those difficulties, but also what are their strengths. Can we, in terms of supporting children, use their strengths to develop their lesser skills? I'll give an example here. A child who's got quite strong BSL, but perhaps their English skills are limited, perhaps their vocabulary is quite limited. Well, BSL could be a very powerful tool to develop children's English skills, which are important, of course, for communication, for literacy, for education. So finding out children's strengths and their weaknesses is very important. And all of these things feed into interventions. So if children aren't developing language in the way we want them to, they'll need support and interventions and the right educational placement. And the other thing about an assessment is that once we have an assessment, we can then look back at how that child performed at a later date and see how they're making progress. And we want to make sure that children are making the expected progress. And if not, then why not? So a little digression here into the world of spoken language testing. These are a small selection of the range of tests of spoken language that there are. I mean, there are hundreds of assessments, and many of these are used with deaf children to look at their spoken language development. And I'm sure many of you will know that BATOD has quite a lot of information about these sorts of language assessments here, if you follow that link. These are all published assessments. I'm going to be calling them formal assessments because they are specially developed and used in a specific way, and they often have normative data telling you what is a typical score for a child of a particular age. These sorts of tests have value, but they also have limitations. So in terms of looking at what we look at when we're looking at spoken language, the tests that we have available allow us to look at a massive range of areas of comprehension, of expressive language, different aspects of language, phonology, syntax, and so on. And there are many tests that test users can use to look at the same domain, and they span the age range, which is what you'd want. And typically, tests have got norms from large samples of children. So you might be comparing a child that you're testing with the scores of hundreds of other children to know what is typical for their age. So this is the normal situation when you're looking at spoken language. I talked a bit about formal assessments, and I talked about some of the advantages already. But what about the disadvantages? Well, these sorts of assessments aren't necessarily suitable for everybody, and indeed some professionals avoid using formal assessments for that reason, and certainly with certain groups I would agree with that. Sometimes the equipment or the test itself may be inappropriate because of cultural differences, and it may not be accessible to all communities in the UK. And as I say, some children, some clients may not respond to a very formal testing situation. And one of the limitations of formal assessments is that although they may come up with a figure, a score, and an idea about whether the child is developing normally or not, they may not give you indications about what you need to do next. So again, this is the skill of interpreting assessment findings. So an alternative is informal assessment or language sampling, where we can literally just engage with the child, as we see in the picture here, playing with a child maybe, or have a conversation with an older child to find out a little bit about how they communicate. This is particularly useful if we're trying to establish the child's preferred means of communication, and especially if we want to look at children's communication in different environments. This is really important because having said that deaf children's language input is variable, if we only sample their communication in one particular setting, we might miss a richness in terms of how they adapt their communication to different communication partners. So it is very important to consider in the assessment process a range of different communication settings for deaf children. So informal assessment allows you to sort of sample, if you like, the range of the child's communicative repertoire. And that can help you also then decide what you're going to do if you're going to use a formal assessment. You know, which assessment are you going to use? Because is there a particular area that's emerging as being in need of exploration? Or is there a particular language sign or spoken language that would be best assessed first? So informal assessment has very high validity. It really tells you something about what is real for that child in say, a range of their settings. But informal assessment places very heavy demands on the assessor. So the skills of the assessor have to be really, really strong to get a lot out of an informal assessment. So, the advantages are you can pluck a toy off a shelf, a book off a shelf. You can carry out an informal assessment anywhere. They're very naturalistic. But a disadvantage, if you like, is that that's open to interpretation as well. But for the clients who can't use formal assessments with, this is very much the way to go. A disadvantage is that it may be a very unstructured approach, and it certainly might be an unreliable approach. Certainly, trying to repeat an informal assessment at another occasion could be very difficult to do because of the lack of structure. Often when you engage in an interaction with a child in an informal way, you get so much data, so much rich data. It's hard to know sometimes what to make of it. But also it's hard to know whether what you've got is comprehensive. And it's also very difficult to relate informal observations to typical stages of development. So I'm hoping what you might be thinking is that a combination of these approaches is ideal. And indeed, that is what I believe that actually, and a combination of informal assessment and formal assessment gives you the best picture of a child's language acquisition. So let's focus now specifically on sign language and what are the assessments in developing and using assessments of sign language. Well, one area is, well, where do we start? What areas should be assessed? And I think the reason I bring this up is a question I've been asking myself for many, many years. But I think because there are now some tools of sign language assessment available, there's a tendency for us to think, oh, it's all done and it's all dusted. We've got what we need. But actually, we still only have assessments that sample a small range of what we need to look at in terms of children's sign language. What methods are appropriate? Well, a lot of methods that are used with spoken language can be adapted to carrying out assessments in sign language, but we should also look at what is unique about sign language and perhaps what traditional methods don't capture. So just to give you an example here, often when you're looking at a child's spoken language development, you might look at a book with them or look at a picture and talk about a picture. Now, that's fine for a spoken language, but in a sign language where you're wanting to set up reference points, if the picture is in front of you and the child you're speaking to, it makes much more sense just to point to parts of the picture. So you don't necessarily see the child's ability to set up the reference points if you're looking at a picture description task. So not all methods are appropriate for children using sign language. One of the big challenges is really a tester issue. When you have a formal assessment of a spoken language, typically there are instructions that the tester gives, and these are written. So the tester just has to read the instructions out. But of course, in sign language, we don't have an easily accessible written form, and it's very important to standardize how an assessment is carried out, because otherwise we're going to be giving different information to different children. So this is a challenge in assessment, and which is why many assessments of sign language use a pre-recorded format, because all the information is then standard. All children who carry out that assessment receive it in the same way. So the test is not introducing variability. A big question with sign language assessments is which group of deaf children should be included when we are developing the test and deriving norms, and how many children is enough? I mentioned before that in spoken language measures, we often get hundreds of children being tested, but of course there aren't necessarily hundreds of children using sign language at a particular age group that are accessible to test developers. We need to think about typical patterns of development that we see in native signers in deaf families, but the test has to be used and applicable more broadly to all children who use sign language. So that includes children from hearing families. So we want to include a whole range of deaf children, and of course as many as we can. And then the question of who is best qualified to carry out these assessments. And I think increasingly we are seeing that, you need to have lots and lots of skills. You need to have fluency and insights into the language. And lots of deaf people have these insights and are ideally suited to be carrying out these sorts of assessment. And in the project that Elizabeth mentioned, the .deaf project, which I hope many of you have come across, we have started to develop training for a group of deaf professionals working with deaf signing children, who we've called deaf language specialists, who we think are ideally suited to carry out assessments, to deliver interventions in sign language. But for this group, there isn't a traditional training route, if you like, to become a deaf language specialist. So our .deaf project has started to develop that sort of training. So if you haven't come across it, please do take a look. So we looked at tests of spoken language, and I told you that the slide I showed you was a sample of them. These are all the tests of spoken language of a single sign language, which is British Sign Language. I'm sorry, I haven't got a slide to show Irish Sign Language here. So these are all the tests that are available for British Sign Language. The link at the bottom of the page shows you a very useful website that shows you a range of assessments of sign language used in lots of different countries. And I think it's very useful to see that, but you can be misled into thinking, gosh, there's loads of assessments of sign language. But when you look at any one language, there are relatively few. And if you then look at the age ranges, we can see that there are 2 potential assessments for preschool children. There are 4 for primary age, and there's only 1 for secondary age. So we have limited assessments for British Sign Language, and I'm pretty sure that's the same for Irish Sign Language, and that is a problem.
Ros, sorry to interrupt. It's
yes.
Elizabeth. I've just had a question in the chat. Will the slides be available for, I think people are trying to take notes and they're wondering would it be okay if you could share slides afterwards?
Very happy to.
Thank you. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of the areas the available assessments look at, we have got some assessments looking at vocabulary, at grammar, at narrative skills, but typically we have one test that looks at one area. We don't have a range of tests. And I say there's a real shortfall in terms of assessments for older children. But I'm very excited to say that Dr. Kate Rowley at UCL, at DCAL, is in the process of developing an assessment for older children. So that's going to be coming out in the next few years with any luck. But one of the limitations that I will say about the available tests is that they are based on small samples of deaf children per age group. And this is because of the numbers of the deaf signing community being small. But we also have to just be a little bit cautious, because when we're looking at small numbers, the risks of variability come in again. So in other words, the norms give you a bit of a flavour of what children might be achieving at a certain age, but it's not as definitive as if you have larger samples. I think I've said this, so I'm going to scoot on because I think I'm taking a little bit longer than I thought, and talk a little bit about testers' skills and knowledge. So I think we'd all understand and agree that we need to have skills to test a child's sign language. We need knowledge about how children develop sign language. We need to have skills in interacting with young children. We need to know about assessment. There's lots of things we need to know. So testers need to be skilled and trained. And sometimes it's not necessarily a single person that has all these skills. So I've always advocated very strongly that assessment needs to be a team approach. And so teams that combine skills, or speech and language therapists, deaf language specialists, teachers of the deaf, I think add a lot to the assessment process. It's important that testers are flexible to be able to accommodate the child's communication skills and to also make the test environment deaf friendly. Sometimes we see testers testing children in environments where perhaps there's too much distraction, too much visual noise that's going on. And testers also need to engage the child with the test materials and know where to start in testing. And sometimes from our experience, we found that tests that have got a couple of practice items, maybe that's not enough for the child to really understand what they need to do. Sometimes children need more training to understand what the test involves. So the tester has to have skills to be able to identify that situation. So let's move on to areas to assess. And a very early area to assess is looking at parent-child interaction. Now, whether a parent is using spoken or sign language, we know that the skills that parents use when they're engaging their babies are really, really vital to children's later language development. And so there's a method called parent-child interaction therapy and parent-child interaction assessment that a lot of speech and language therapists, and I think probably teachers also engage in. Now, I think people have lots of different ways of approaching this. How do we actually assess a parent interacting with their child? What skills are we looking at? So although lots of people do it, there isn't a lot of agreement about how we do it. But there's some new research being carried out by Martina Curtin at the moment, one of my PhD students, who is developing an assessment tool that will allow us to look at parent-child interaction in a more systematic way for parents who use spoken or sign language, or indeed both. So other sorts of areas to look at, well, we have the NDCS, what actually was, it used to be called the monitoring protocol, now called the Success from the Start materials, which allow you to track lots of areas of development that are potentially at risk of development, with deafness, but within the context of the whole child. So looking at communication and listening, but also looking at children's play and their physical development. And what's nice about this pack is that it is an assessment pack, but it also does support intervention. It helps parents and the professionals who work with parents to support development in this age range. I imagine many of you will know this, so I'm going to sort of whiz through these next few slides. I think I won't dwell just because time is short, but you will have a chance to look at the slides later. So the monitoring protocol, what I did want just to tell you was that the monitoring protocol does have some sort of scales, if you like, for BSL development towards the end of it. So it's looking here in this particular example of what you'd expect a child between sort of 2 to 2.5 years of age to be exhibiting in terms of their BSL. So there is information about BSL as well as spoken language. And at this very early stage, I think this is very, very applicable to Irish Sign Language. We have an assessment of early vocabulary that has norms for American Sign Language and now British Sign Language, which is the MacArthur-Bates Communicative Development Inventories. And this is a parent report tool. So parents complete the assessment. It's a series of sheets that they have to look at to see whether a child understands a word or indeed uses the sign for that object or activity. Information about many of these tests, incidentally, is on the DCAL portal. I imagine that you will know about that. It's recently been revamped. So by all means, take a look at these assessments there. The checklist looks at a whole range of vocabulary that you'd expect children to be using in their early years. So animal names, vehicles, toys, action words, and so on. Moving on to a slightly older age group now, sort of from 3+. This is a very old picture from the British Sign Language Receptive Skills Test when it was first developed, when it was a video-based, remember videos? A video-based tool. It then went to DVD format, and it is now available online through the DCAL portal with updated test forms. So this is a test that looks at children's understanding of BSL sentences containing different syntactic constructions. The value of this test, in a sense, is that it requires very little tester skill and can give you a really nice snapshot of whether a child has age-appropriate understanding of BSL within this age range. And the online assessment generates a report that identifies areas of grammar that children score particularly lowly in. So you can actually use this as a way of beginning to address areas of intervention if that looks like it's necessary. It has two aspects to it. There's a vocabulary check just to make sure that children know the vocabulary used in the test, because it's not a test of vocabulary, it's a test of grammar. And then there is the main test, where children look at sentences. In fact, it's Kate Rowley presenting these sentences in the BSL version, and they choose the picture that corresponds to the meaning of the sentence that they've seen. I'm going to whiz rapidly on to the BSL production test, which we produced at around about the same time as the receptive skills test. And in a way, they work quite well together, because one is looking at receptive skills and one is looking at expressive language skills. There is a spoken language version of this, which actually, interestingly, sometimes we think about developing sign language tests based on what spoken language tests offer. Here we've got a spoken language version based on the sign language test. So watch out for that in due course. That will be available soon. So this test looks at children's more naturalistic expressive language. Children watch a video and they tell the story to somebody they think doesn't know the story. And narrative skills, we know, are very sensitive to being measured in this period of the primary school years. And in hearing children, there's good research to show that they relate to children's literacy and academic skills later on. They're also very sensitive to language impairments. So it's a very good way to look at children who do have language impairments in a sign language by using a narrative test. So the test format, as I mentioned, is where children watch a short video, they tell the story, and they answer some questions. And the story is analysed on a range of levels. You need to be a trained tester to do this, carry out this test, and there is online training now available. And a quick plug, we do have a few places left for the test that's going, the training course that's starting at the end of February, if anybody's interested, see the link below. So we look at the content of children's stories, so it's how much information they tell us about the story. And these are the sorts of things that happen in the story. The story is about a girl who gets a lot of food and tries to eat the food, and this annoying boy keeps taking the food away from her. It looks at how children structure the story. So do they talk about the start of the story, who the characters are? Do they talk about the sequence of events that build up to the high point of the story? Do they talk about what happens afterwards? And do they get the story components in the right order? And then the test also looks at aspects of BSL grammar. And this is an example of looking at some of the features. We look at spatial verbs, agreement verbs, aspect. Sorry, I haven't got time to go into that any further. We also look at role shift, because of course role shift is a very important part of storytelling in any sign language. I won't dwell on those now, because I want to talk a bit more about interpreting test scores. So the important thing about any assessment is, of course, that it's an opportunity to reflect on what you found out about a child. And I don't think any good tester would literally see a child for the first time, run a test and get a score and think that's what they know about the child. I hope from what I've said to you already, it's much more complicated than that. We need to have a relationship with the child. We want to sample a range of communication contexts and then see whether their test performance actually mirrors what we've seen in other settings. And sometimes it will and sometimes it won't. We need to think about other things that are specific to the child. So, what is their exposure to sign language? At what age have they had exposure to sign language and how much? Because that's going to affect their test performance. So if we find that a child is underperforming, we need to think, well, is that because the child has a language problem, or perhaps they're not getting the right sort of input? Perhaps they've only been exposed to sign language for a year or two, and that explains why. And test scores are important because we want to think about what we found out about the child and to what extent that tells us how the child will function in their everyday life. So, for example, in the classroom. So finding out how a child understands language and uses language is going to be very important for thinking about how they access the language of the curriculum. So coming to a conclusion here, I hope I've made the case that I think language assessment is very important for all deaf children and should be repeated regularly. So just because we see that a child is doing quite well at a certain stage in their development doesn't mean that they will stay at that stage. And I think what I find very worrying sometimes is that, we'll get a very positive assessment and then a school will say, well, okay, that child doesn't need so much support because they're doing so well. And then what happens? Well, the child doesn't do so well. They deteriorate, if you like, in their performance. So we need to be regularly repeating our assessment to monitor their progress throughout their education. We need to constantly be considering not only the child, but also the environment around the child and the language input they get, because this is how they develop their language. We need to think about the range of modes that communication the child uses, the range of languages they use, perhaps several spoken languages, perhaps several sign languages, and the context that they find themselves in. And we need to acknowledge the fact that there are still far too few assessments, and the assessments we've got are a start, but they're not by any means all we need. And I think the final point really is that it's a complex process, and assessment needs skilled assessors. And I think deaf people have a key role here to play in assessing sign language because they have so many strengths and insights into the language itself. Just to end, Elizabeth did mention that we do have a clinical activity at City, probably less relevant for yourselves over in Ireland, but it's something to think about, I suppose, whether that something like this is necessary in Ireland as well for Irish Sign Language users, because the sorts of children we get referred are often children where their language is not developing typically, and people want another pair of eyes on a child. We managed to get a multi-professional team of deaf and hearing staff involved in the assessment process, and we try and work with local teams to make recommendations for the children's language environment and strategies for intervention. A few additional references for you, but that's all from me, so thank you very much. I will make the slides available, and do get in touch if you have any questions, and I think probably I will stop screen sharing now. And I'm also going to wave my hands wildly because the light in my room has gone off and I'm looking very red. So it's me trying to get, there we go. No longer red.
Good to see that you have the same lighting system that we have here in DCU, Ros. I had to go up and I had to get up and do a dance in the middle of your presentation as well to get mine to switch back on. Thank you so much for that detailed and very thought-provoking presentation. We have time for questions, and maybe perhaps just before I open it to the floor, generally, if I could start with just one point to make, which is that you asked, whether are we in the same boat in terms of the lack of assessments that we have here in ISL, and I think we are probably in a different boat in that we have fewer than you have in BSL, where there are very few there. And I suppose, what would you say to us in the Irish context in terms of prioritising our initial steps in this area? If you could maybe go back to where the situation was for BSL maybe 2 or 3 decades ago, with the hindsight that you have now, what do you think should be our priority here in this area?
That's a very good question, Elizabeth. And yeah, I'll take a moment to think about it. I mean, I think where we started was from the research on sign language acquisition. So I think that's a really important place to start. A lot of the research on sign language acquisition is not in BSL and certainly not in ISL. A lot of it is in ASL and indeed other spoken languages. And these languages, of course, have differences, but they also have areas of overlap. So I think sometimes we can look into the research and find out, what would be expected for children's development, language development in sign language at a certain age and stage, if you like. So, for example, the emergence of first signs coincides quite closely with first words. Sometimes there's a slight sign advantage. We see that in a range of sign languages. So I think we'd expect that for Irish Sign Language as well. And then the age and stage of, the next stage of beginning to combine signs and starting to produce signed sentences happens towards the end of the second year. So getting a good understanding of sign language acquisition, I think, is a really good place to start. The other thing that I would also mention is that I think it's really difficult to adapt a test of spoken language to sign language. I wouldn't advise that at all, because tests have been developed for a particular purpose in a particular language, and sign language is very different to spoken language. But what we have seen is that adapting a test of sign language to another sign language can be quite successful. So that's an area perhaps to think about, for the future. And I know that I've spoken to people in Ireland about this, and I think some of the assessments we've developed, actually, to be honest, particularly the production test, I think, lend itself quite well to an adaptation, because the narrative skills part is probably going to be very similar. It's the grammar, and the grammar, there are similarities between BSL and ISL. There are differences too, but you can look at where those differences would be and make those sorts of changes. So we've made adaptations of that test, for example, to Australian Sign Language, ASLAN, which has a lot of similarities, but again, it has some differences as well with British Sign Language. So adapting existing sign language tests could be a good way forward. But I think there's nothing that will really replace getting into the sort of the literature on how children learn a sign language, to just get, I think testers need to have a very good grounding in that to undertake this role.
That's great. Thank you, Ros. We have time for questions. So if people would like to either type their question into the chat box, or I think that you have the possibility to turn on a microphone if you want to speak your question, and to turn on your video if you would like to sign a question. So we have a couple of different options open for people. Just give us enough notice that we're able to find where you are.
Perhaps while the questions are brewing or maybe coming, I will ask a question back, which is, what is kind of current practice in Ireland? If you've got a sign language user, how does assessment take place?
I think that's an excellent question, and I know that there are people in the audience who would be well positioned to answer that, but I'm not sure if they want to do that, or if they would rather that I take a stab at it myself. But I know from scrolling through the names here that we have some people from the Visiting Teacher Service and from schools, the School for the Deaf. I think we have some people from speech and language therapy backgrounds who would be able to answer on that. But my understanding is that it has been a multidisciplinary approach, in that you would usually have maybe a speech and language therapist work alongside someone who's deaf and a fluent user in sign language, and that they would work in tandem to try and ascertain where a child's language development is at. Also, I think borrowing from other assessment measures that are used in, for example, spoken language or in other sign languages, not using them in a way that maybe might be able to give you something that would be a valid norm referenced result, but something that would give you some sort of information that you could use to build a holistic profile on that particular child. But I think that it's an area that we struggle with a little. Sorry, we've something, Paul, you've responded there with a question. Yeah, so I think it's probably something that we struggle with a little in this context, but I would be open to somebody telling me that I'm wrong on that. Paul, your question here, would there be a role for coupling adaptive functioning tests such as the ABAS to such assessment? It covers an aspect of communication. Paul, coming from an educational psychology background, am I right, Paul? You can nod or shake your head, I can see. Yeah. Do you want to turn on your microphone there, Paul? And maybe if you have, yeah.
Hi.
Hello. Nice to see you.
So sometimes we would use, as part of our own assessments, would be the ABAS, which has, there's aspects of communication, and it would be norm referenced. Of course, it would be norm referenced for the UK, because like most tests, there's very few standardized tests that are kind of available in Ireland. But it's also an aspect where it could couple with the language aspect as well, just because it's kind of functional communication as well.
Yes, I'm not actually familiar with that test, but actually you have got me thinking about another type of test, which I think is quite a good place to sort of start, which is not a norm reference test in quite the same way, but maybe it's more for criterion referenced. So something like the Pragmatic Profile, which adapts itself, I think, really well to actually, spoken and sign language, because it's looking at really what the child is communicating, as well as how they are doing it. Are they, for example, making requests? Are they refusing things? So this is another aspect which I think is very valuable when you're looking at a child's communication skills. And I'd sort of say the Pragmatic Profile is quite adaptable. It's obviously not developed for sign languages, but I think it's quite language free in a way. I don't know if it's something that you've come across, Paul or Elizabeth, but something like that, where you're asking parents questions. I think those sorts of things can give you a lot of information.
Ros, yeah, we would use it in the school, in the Holy Family School a lot, because you can get parental report as well as reports from teachers using it. So kind of find it useful that way to get kind of that holistic view of the child. And I think Elizabeth said it really well. That's in the school, that's how we do our assessments with the ISL tutor, an ISL interpreter, and myself, the speech and language therapist. I think that is kind of has seemed to be the best way, and then get the input from the family as much as possible, as well as the input from all the educators, so that you have different, I suppose, areas that the child will communicate with. And we found with the younger kids, the BSL, the narrative assessment, quite well. We could use that very well, as well as the receptive. But as they got older, particularly in the post-primary, we're really struggling to assess them. So we're using a lot of our clinical judgments, our understanding of ISL, and kind of problem solving that way, rather than anything norm referenced. Just the English assessments. I did one today, and it was on vocabulary, and you just couldn't interpret the spoken vocabulary into ISL and get a true reflection of their skills. It was the BPVS. It's you're just not able to. So it's a real struggle for us, especially when we're applying for supports in our education system, like leaving certs or junior cert supports, and you need language assessment and scores. So we're using you know, clinical judgment and understanding of ISL. So I think if anyone in research in Ireland could do something with ISL assessments, it would be great. Even some of the new ones coming out in BSL for the post-primary level, it'd be great to even be able to adapt them to ISL.
That sounds an excellent idea, but I think also the approach you've described is, I think that's also, you know, very, very appropriate. I think you're right about the whole challenge of the secondary, you know, the older child looking at their language skills, because of course not every deaf child will have, you know, their language in place by secondary. You know, you obviously want to give them the best input they can, so that as they get older, their language is enabling them to access education. But there are going to be some for whom that's not the case, and I think that's where we have a real problem with the available measures. They're not really suitable for all. I mean, I think the actual format, you know, is too childish for children. I think it's one thing if you've got children who've got you know, difficulties, like learning difficulties, and maybe they're just, you know, just at the start of secondary, then I think you can stretch to using some of these tests, but I think it's not appropriate to use them for older children. So that is a problem.
I'm going to stop the recording just